Hey, what's up everybody, Crazy here, back into Borderlands with some big news to go over because the game, as you may or may not know, has just launched on Steam. As a matter of fact, Gearbox is even running a 50% discount for all of the versions of the game, including the Deluxe and the Super Deluxe editions. So really awesome stuff, especially for those who have been holding off for a year at this point. But for everybody else who is still playing on the Epic Games launcher, you probably encountered this if you upgraded to the latest patch that dropped a few moments ago. So this is PC crossplay that is gonna work between Steam and Epic Games Store, and it's pretty straightforward. All you have to do is to press continue, and on the second prompt it's going to ask you to input another username, since this is gonna be all provided by the shift functionality. So enable that again, go in, and you're pretty much set. You don't have to do anything outside of this. Anyway, on a second note, I also want to cover yesterday's patch that brought in a ton of buffs for a lot of weapons. So what I did is I've tested all of these weapons to see exactly how much that damage increase was in percentages, and kind of make an idea of how much the damage overall impacts, especially on Mayhem 4. So that is why in this video I'm going to go over all of the list of changes over here. As always, if you enjoyed this video, a thumbs up on it would be super awesome, but I'm gonna start things off with the Boomer, and in this case it got a straight out weapon damage increase from my calculations of about 27%, from 391 times 2 to 496 times 2, but it's also applied to the elemental damage from 483 to 625, though in this case it was 29%, so within the margin of error. But one thing that also changed with the Boomer, which I didn't expect, was the fact that the anointed effect that increases bonus radiation damage also got an increase from 65% to 115%, and I'm not entirely sure why. It's the exact same weapon and I couldn't find any of these changes listed in the patch notes, so not entirely sure what's up with that, but do expect similar changes to your weapons too. In this case, the Boomer tested on Mayhem 4 on my Omara, but without actually using any items, just the weapons themselves behaved quite well, I might say. It might not be the best weapon for Mayhem 4, but it did pretty well against most of the trash mobs. It didn't behave that well against shielded enemies for obvious reasons, but whenever there were like flash enemies, or if the shields were down, it managed to pretty much destroy everything in seconds. So a pretty nice increase, not the biggest of them all by any definition, but it's a nice increase nonetheless. The second one is the Garcia shotgun. This one drops from Chunk Stomp in the Floodmore Basin, and this had a fire rate increase, as well as the number of projectiles that it shoots have also been increased. In my case, the fire rate went from 3.0 to 4.3, and the projectiles from ×8 to ×12. And I will say this, the damage increase is definitely noticeable. It's not like a weapon increase or anything, but the fact that it shoots faster and there's more projectiles is definitely quite significant. I would even say that this is quite a viable weapon for Mayhem 4. Not sure exactly if it was up until now, since I wasn't using it that much out of Mayhem 3, but it does behave really well, even better than the previous ones, and it's definitely one of the best buffs I've seen so far from the weapons on today's list. So really awesome one. It definitely, you know, kind of gives me an incentive to go in and play the Garcia once more, since it's one of the shotguns that I like the most. The Hellfire SMG is the next one. This one drops from the Jabbermongwai in the Voracious Canopy, and there's two buffs that this weapon got. The first one is the weapon damage, in my case from 272 to 640, which is an almost 70% damage increase over there, and the second buff was for the damage over time of around 153%, from 856 fire damage per second to more than 2000, which is a pretty substantial damage amount over there. Pretty big, but I wouldn't say that this weapon became any more viable for Mayhem 4. It still felt kinda weak, though that might have been because of my build, so I'm not entirely sure if this is gonna be that much more viable than it's been. Maybe a more substantial buff would be required, because even in this case it still underperforms quite a bit, even though it's one of my favorite, you know, weapons, especially when it was usable on Mayhem 3, but for Mayhem 4 I don't think it's gonna be any more usable, even despite all of these buffs. Correct me down if I'm mistaken with this one. Let me know if you're using any different builds that make it useful, because in my case I couldn't make it that much more useful than it's been before. Nonetheless, at number 4 we have the Hyper Focus, also SMG. This one drops from the Power Troopers in Atlas HQ, and this one got a pretty sizable increase, and it's also much more useful right now, even on Mayhem 4, to the point that I was quite surprised by just how much more useful it is. So the weapon damage has been increased according to the patch notes, about 75% increase overall, from 384 in my case to 673, sorry for that. But yeah, the stats over here were pretty awesome. There was a pretty nice increase, but I also saw the stats changes on the actual card from minus 20% damage to plus 40 for some reason. That one kind of fits within the 75% increase, and also the elemental damage increased by another roughly 75% as it was the case with the bullet damage. But I will say the Hyper Focus behaved really well against most of the trash mobs. Not really sure how it's gonna behave against, you know, most boss enemies, but as long as you're going against big groups, this behaves really well on Mayhem 4. Moving on to number 5, we have the Link. This is a drop from the anointed alpha enemy in the Anvil region. This is just a straight out increased weapon damage of about 90% from my calculation, almost double from how it was in the past, but it's still not the best out there. It still like suffers from like everything that most of the weapons with auto tracking suffer, as in if you use the auto tracking, you're not going to be able to hit those weak points, which means that it's going to be a significant drop in DPS. But if you are aiming for weak points, if you don't use the tracking capabilities, it behaves really well. I'm not gonna lie, it does tend to overwhelm the enemies quite a bit, but for everything else above that, it kind of falls off, and it's not something that I would constantly use on Mayhem 4 again. Anyway, the next one is gonna be the Nemesis, and honestly a weapon that I kind of like the way it works. I was hoping that this would behave much better against the loader bots in the Handsome Jackpot DLC, especially now that it got an all-around 60% damage increase for bullets and the elemental effect on it, but for some reason I just couldn't get it to work to the level I was expecting it to work. Like, even the 60% damage increase wasn't enough to make it truly feel like it got buffed, since it took an eternity for me to just go in and kill one single loader bot with this weapon. So probably something that I'm going to continue to not use on anything above Mayhem 3 at this point. The next one is gonna be the Nimble Jack, the one that drops from Handsome Jackie in Skywell 27. Actually one of my favorite shotguns, since it is kind of fun to just hop around and kind of take advantage of that increased accuracy. But it did get a weapon damage increase of approximately 45%, and there's also the added 100% bonus critical damage on its card too. So I did test this around. It's good. It's actually pretty good on Mayhem 4. Nothing that I would go against a boss or anything, but it's really fun to aim those headshots, and now with a hugely increased damage, it's really easy to take down a bunch of enemies at the same time, especially since it kind of tends to ricochet that damage into other enemies too. So really nice weapon over here, always had fun with it, so I'm glad that it actually got buffed. It's kind of useful for Mayhem 4, though there is one other shotgun on today's list that outperforms this by quite a significant margin. Anyway, the next one is the Ogre. This one drops from the Anointed Alpha in the Anvil. It, from my calculation, got an increase of about 35% for the model that I have, and the card also reads plus 49% weapon damage, so it seems pretty sweet. It does look like it got a pretty significant buff. I would have loved if it had a little bit more, but it does sound like it could be useful for a number of builds out there, even on Mayhem 4. The next one is gonna be the One Pump Chump. This one drops from One Punch in Electro City Underground region, but this is like one of the most powerful shotguns in the game. This has always been one of the most powerful shotguns in the game, and it got an overall 20% bullet damage increase, which is also consistent with the stats on the weapon damage. So it does sound like it's now way more useful than before, and I did play around with this on Mayhem 4. It feels powerful, it feels very good, especially when you kind of get those crits bullets going on, and you don't have to reload the only one bullet that you have. So it gets really fun, very damaging even against the most toughest enemies, and especially so when you can go in and shoot multiple bullets without actually reloading. So really awesome weapon, glad that the increase was there as well. The next one is Roizen's Thorns, a drop from Princess Tarantella 2 in the Splinterlands. This one got a nice buff, as a matter of fact, both for weapon damage and for the elemental damage of about 53 to 55%, which definitely makes it viable on Mayhem 4 even on its own. It definitely behaved really well against most of the enemies, including the ones with shields, including loader bots, pretty much against anything that I put it up. It definitely behaves really nicely, and when I mixed in a bunch of abilities or debuffs on the enemies, it behaved even better. Probably like not top tier or anything, but it does seem pretty awesome, and definitely something that I would probably be using on Mayhem 4 if I were to have fun with these types of weapons. The next three weapons, which are the Sawbar, the Skeksil, and the Tankman's Shield, for some reason didn't show any, change on their respective cards, even though I did test this properly both before the hotfix was applied and after, so I'm not entirely sure why that was the case, but this is the review for all of them. So the Sawbar, this one saw an increase in weapon damage, as well as adjusted the timing of when the three projectiles split to be sooner, but even despite all of this buff over here, I would still call this weapon situational, even more so on something like Mayhem 4, since those projectiles have to be kind of, properly adjusted. You have to be at the proper distance from the enemies to take advantage of all of the three explosions happening and all of the three split explosions happening. So this is something that I would still not use at all because of its functionality. It does have a pretty decent damage, it had pretty decent damage on Mayhem 4 even in the past, so now it's a little bit more desirable, but I'm not entirely sure if its mechanic makes it that much better. The next one is the Skeksil. This one got an extra projectile damage, again not entirely sure how much that is, but it does feel like one of the more powerful weapons on today's list, especially those extra projectiles that happen once you kinda not reload but kinda like end the burst of fire. They do feel very powerful, they tend to pretty much wreck enemies on Mayhem 4, it doesn't matter if it's like tougher ones or trash mobs, it wrecks through everything. So yeah, go ahead, check it out, it's something that I had quite a ton of fun with, and it drops from Scrack in the Ascension Bluff if you want to go ahead and take it. The last one is gonna be Tankman's Shield, a drop from Captain Trond in Athena's. To my surprise, this behaved really well even before, but now it seems to have been buffed by quite a bit. So the maximum damage cap on it has been increased by 200%, meanwhile the increased percent damage awarded per kill has also been increased, though it didn't show exactly how much that is, the patch notes doesn't reveal that, but this was a pretty good sniper rifle even before this buff. For example, if you were combining it with something like Moe's, it would definitely behave really well, you could definitely stack a ton of damage with this per kill. So yeah, the cap has been increased and it's now even bigger, and you also get more percentage damage awarded per each individual kill, so it should definitely be much better on Mayhem 4. Anyway, this is it with the latest news, this is it with the latest changes. I'm looking forward for whatever Gearbox has next for the game. As always, if you want to see more Borderlands here on this channel, make sure you comment, like and subscribe, and I'm gonna see you guys in the next one.